Hello everybody, Aleen Wilson here. Today I'm going to begin a story about John again. I've read to you some of the book that he wrote about growing up in the Depression. But prior to that, he had written a recollection for our children titled, Dear David and Mary. I'm going to read what he had to say about this. These are John's words. I started the following collection of genealogical data and personal anecdotes as a Dear David and Mary letter. It was supposed to tell our children of my branch of the family and what it was like growing up in the Depression years in the South Carolina textile bed. But it grew. I kept adding things, especially autobiographical things, until I had amassed a lot of information. Chapter 1, The Early Life. Again, John's words. I was born in Rock Hill, but the first thing I remember was in Welford. We were living at Jackson Mill, where my father was the weave room overseer, in a frame house not far from the mill. I came from the back porch to the top step and looked down. There were lots of ripe peaches scattered around the backyard, and they were swarming with bees. That's all I can remember. I was preschool age in the late 20s when we lived in that house. We had a Buick touring car, complete with side curtains that buttoned down, much like World War II Jeep side curtains. There was a building in the back of the house that housed cars of people lucky enough to have them. They weren't called garages. They were called car sheds. Because that's all they were. Each building held about 4 or 5 cars. The Buick was the first car I remember, but Doyle said at one time we had a car called a Durante. According to Doyle, while we lived in Rock Hill, my parents carefully saved up a nest egg, and Dave went out and bought that Buick. It made Penny furious. He was always doing something impulsive like that. Let me explain. Doyle was a brother, Dave was his father, and Penny was his mother. Just down the street was the community building. That's where a lot of the women gathered for quilting bees. They had a big frame that let down from the ceiling to the middle of the floor, and they all sat around stitching and gabbing. Daddy also conducted his loom fixing classes there, and it was the scene of other community things as well. Down the street lived a family called Birch. The Birch family was a local legend because Mrs. Birch was always on the back porch loudly yelling for her son Henry. After 6 or 7 loud yells, Henry would stick his head around the corner and ask in a soft voice, "Was you calling me?" The second house I remember was a larger one beside the railroad track in Welford. It was the main line between Washington and Atlanta and was a double track. The sound of trains and whistles became so commonplace that we soon learned to turn them off. I think the psychologists now call that negative adaptation. We had a chicken yard on the railroad side of the house where we raised Dominecker hens and other chickens from live chicks that my mother ordered by mail. We'd kill a chicken for Sunday dinner by wringing its neck, and when the neck was severed, the chicken body would flop around the yard until it finally died. Then came the chore of dousing the chicken's body with hot water and plucking feathers until the carcass was clean. The wet feathers smelled foul, no pun intended. Then the chicken was fried in a pan. We never tried deep fat frying because that took too much grease. On Sunday we played in the front yard after church, and in the mid-afternoon in the summertime somebody would tense up for the charging of the ice cream wagon bell. It would come from the direction of Highway 29 at Tuckapaw and was a modified station wagon, only taller, with paned windows all around. The favorite was ice cream cones. Sometimes somebody would get rash and order an ice cream sandwich. The man inside would first place a large, square, crisp wafer onto a metal form, fill it with ice cream, then place another wafer on top. Then he'd turn it right side up, and out would come a sandwich. I think they cost 10 cents. We have ice cream sandwiches now, but they're made in the factory, and I doubt if you could find one of the old-fashioned crisp kind. Soon we moved to a larger house, just a few numbers up the street along the railway. It had a large L-shaped wrap-around front porch and a screened back porch which was considerably higher off the ground than the front of the house. We were playing I Spy in the backyard once when I ran for the house base of a utility pole, trying to escape whoever was it. Bynum Bike Murray was standing in front of the pole waiting for me, and I thought he was going to catch me when I reached the pole. He didn't understand this. At the last moment he stepped aside, and I smashed face first into the pole. There was a lot of blood, and that ended the I Spy game. Since then, I have never trusted anyone to catch me. Sister Grace once chased me through the house to the back porch, and as I went through the back screen porch, she slammed the door on me, catching my thumb. My finger was bandaged for weeks, and to this day one thumb has a larger, thicker nail than the other. Down the street lived Grady and Clarence Painter, who were a little older than we. I encountered them years later when I was a reporter on the Herald in Spartanburg, and they were on the police force. Grady was a dispatcher, and Clarence was a detective. I recall them vividly because Clarence was shot in the finger by a suspected criminal, and the afternoon paper came out with big headlines on him. I wonder what size headline they would have had used if he had been shot in the head. Also down the street lived Gerald and Charles Jordan, second cousins about my age. A neighborhood boy came up with a toy wooden boat, which he floated around the water-covered bottom of a storm pit in the front yard. Cousin Gerald came out with a fried pie, and the boy offered to swap him even. They swapped. Soon the boy had eaten the pie, but Gerald still had the boat. It was another good lesson for me. When you obtain something that will last a while. The storm pit, incidentally, was to protect us from tornadoes, which seemed more prevalent in those days. Storm pits were not uncommon around this part of South because storms seemed to terrorize people in the days before we had such good forecasting. We looked forward to swimming in the river. It was a branch of the Tiger, and it was about a couple of miles from Jackson Mills. The road there was unpaved, and I used to watch with interest as the thick road dust would come squishing up through my toes. Some of us used to go to another swimming hole, but I can't remember where it was. We dammed it up ourselves. Naturally, we had no bathing suits, and the swimming was au naturel. We floated on our backs a lot because there was not enough room for Olympic swimming. We didn't even know what that was. There was always lots of bullfrogs around the pond, and Cousin Gerald said they chorused, "Balloop, ballyroop, Kulasho." That last part was when they splashed into the water. Another thing we did for fun when we lived in Greer was go to Ponder's Ice Cream Parlor, which was downtown only a few blocks from our house. Ponder sold a huge ice cream cone for a nickel, and everybody tried to lick slowly so he would be the last with the most. We were on our way home once licking the cones, and Sister Grace looked around at the rest of us trailing behind and said, "For goodness sakes, hurry up. Y'all look like Pharaoh's army." To this day, I don't know what she was talking about, even after I learned that Pharaoh was a title. When I was in the 4th grade, we moved from Greer to Tuckapaw. I spent most of the rest of my growing up years there. We lived in a house at the foot of a hill looking over a fenced-in pasture. That was called the Red Egyptian portion of Tuckapaw. Another part was the 500 community. I never learned how the 500 neighborhood got its name, but Red Egypt seemed appropriate enough. Some parts of Tuckapaw had sewer service, but Red Egypt did not. We had an outdoor privy, and ours was a 2-holer. I always puzzled why they made 2-holers because only one person used them at a time. It was customary for a mill worker to bring home toilet paper from the mill supply room. The mill did not object. I guess that was considered a fringe benefit. Sisters Liv and Grace were teenagers, and there were always a flock of boys around. They sat on the front steps with somebody playing a guitar and everybody singing. Clyde Cox was always the one who played the guitar. I suppose it's because nobody else could play. One of the songs I remember was Dark Town Strutter's Ball, and I never heard it, but that I think of those first days in Red Egypt. The mill houses sat up on brick pillars to conform to the terrain. The pillars were usually tall enough for us to play under on rainy days. We would construct roads of mud strips and move imaginary cars down them. Pardon me. When we moved across the river into Tuckapaw proper, we considered that a step up because the houses were nicer and we had a flush toilet. It was unusual. When you sat down, it activated a silent spring. When you stood up, the spring device went into action and it noisily flushed. In all my travels through Europe, Africa, and Asia, I've never seen or heard a toilet like that. Even when we had sewer service, at first we had no running water in the kitchen, although we were equipped with double sinks, a shallow one for dishes and a deeper one covered by a wooden cover for laundry. The kitchen also had one built-in dish cupboard. We toted water from a communal outside spigot in the backyard of a neighbor. Even at the early age, I wondered why we had sewer service but no running water in the kitchen. There was a tennis court in the next block in Tuckapaw, but few of us ever played tennis because it was, first, a foreign sport, and second, few people had tennis rackets. We were proud of the tennis court, though, because then tennis was considered a rich man's sport, and we thought that having a court put us in a higher social bracket. The tennis court was behind John Ford's house, which had a huge magnolia tree in the front yard. The entire area is now part of the grounds of Tuckapaw Baptist Church. The house at 2 Oak Street had a level front yard thanks to a former occupant, Vance Jackson, who terraced it and built a cement walkway from the front steps to the curb. One side of the street had curbs and gutters, and the other had sidewalks as well. The roads were dirt at first, but later were paved. I would run barefoot from Ms. Freeman's house up the street all the way to Maple Street and thought I was going 90 miles an hour. The town is bisected by the Middle Tiger River, a small river that was dammed above the mill to make a huge pond. A metal flume went from the dam to the mill, presumably to generate power. A flume is a conduit that carries water, usually is several feet in diameter and several hundred yards long. They had versions of them in the Roman days, but they were made of stone. I think they called them aqueducts. The metal bridge over the river has been replaced by a more modern one, but I understand that they kept the old one as a memento. Between the dam and the downstream bridge were rocky shoals with small pockets of water. We used to play there because they were safe enough. Jack Griffith and I used to use the grassy slope down to the shoals for a sliding place in the wintertime when the grass was dry. We used large pieces of corrugated cardboard boxes as sleds. One of the bad things I remember about Tuckapaw was the odor. It literally stank, especially in the summertime. We always assumed it came from the bleachery upstream, but we're never sure. The odors were so bad it would curl the paint right off the houses. It smelled like rotten eggs. I hope the environmental people have taken care of it by now. The mill operated a company store, but there were at least 2 other groceries available. They were Cooch Southern's and nearby Sloan's store. StarTech's elementary school grounds are about where they are now. We did most of our trading at Cooch's store, although the others were bigger and had a larger variety of goods. The company store was on the main street near the post office. We could use bobos or coin tokens with holes punched in their middles. Mill workers could get bobos from the store office, and they would be deducted from their weekly pay. Bobos were good only at the company store. The company store also sold shoes, dry goods, and had a pharmacy. Ed Linder was the man in charge of the shoe store. We called the pharmacy operator Doc, but I can't remember his name. He may have been a pharmacist, but he was not an MD. The only physician in town was Dr. Sam Moore, who had a house on Main Street and operated an office at first in quarters above the company store, accessible by metal steps outside the building. Later, Dr. Moore moved his practice to a frame house on a nearby corner. Opposite and down the street from the post office was a multi-story building called simply the hotel. Many of the teachers lived there, although it was also home to other transient people. For many years, there were few telephones in town, but the hotel had one, which many people used in cases of emergency. Few people had telephones, but it's just as well. We didn't know how to use them. First, you would pick up the phone and listen to make sure nobody was using it. If not, you would ring up, then turn the crank several times to summon the operator. Then you'd pick up again when Central answered, and you'd give her the number you wanted and wait for the response. Because of the lack of space in the Red Brick Grammar School across the river, the fourth grade was split into two, and one part met in a room accessible from the outside of the hotel. We had a spelling bee there once, and I reached the finals. Frida McDonald and I were the only two left, and I stumbled on the word sacred. For some reason, I spelled it scared. Later, when I heard the expression Freudian slip, I understood exactly what it meant. I knew how to spell sacred, but I was scared. Anyway, Frida won. She later was named class valedictorian. Mary Freeman was salutatorian, and I was third. I was not bitter because I got to sit on the stage at graduation. The only time I ever made a failing mark was an F for history in the 5th grade. I was so mortified that I did not take my report card home to Daddy for the usual signature of acknowledgement. I told the teacher I lost the card. He was tolerant enough and told me to look again. After 2 or 3 days, I got up enough nerve to approach my father and presented him the report card. His only response was, He signed it, and that was that. Another time, I proudly told him I made 99 on the test. His response was, well, that's damn nigh high. He let it go at that, and so did I. My father seldom used profanity. That was the few times I remember. Another time he got mad at something involving me in the garden hose pipe and said in exasperation, Jesus Christ, don't you remember what you did with it? The house was low to the ground, and we had little space for storing a lawnmower. For many years we kept the old black iron pot we used for washing clothes there. We used a broomstick for stirring the clothes in the pot, which sat upright on 3 short legs with a fire underneath. We were still using this when I went off to the Army. One of the first things I bought when I returned from the Army was a clothes washing machine. It was a front-loader Bendix, and Bull Mason installed it, so the wastewater ran from the kitchen to the ground outside. Later, he hooked it to the sewer system. I suppose Penny used a wood-burning stove at first, but as long as I can remember, she used a kerosene stove. She finally switched to a tabletop kerosene stove, which looked like an electric range. Then she installed an electric stove. She was always afraid of it. However, I'm surprised she ever had the nerve. As for gas stoves, forget it. She was deathly afraid of gas in any form. Down by the river lived a woman with a lot of children whose husband had died, leaving her in dire straits. Once the neighbors had a pounding party for her. That is, everybody who went carried her a pound of food, whether canned or otherwise. She was a motherly type who always seemed to have time for children, any children, her own, other children. She deserved more than a pounding. About bullbat time, we would gather around the street light and talk about things. Somebody said someday we would have machines and could match right up and push a button, and there would appear the kind of food we wanted. We didn't know automats already existed. Homer Crow would listen and say, "Golly, right, I'd just wear out that button for banana pudding." There was another family down by the river, Gob Rollins, his real name was Garvin, would set us up on his front porch to play rook. One day we tricked him. Somebody found a dead snake and used a string to put it in a striking position near one of the bushes in front of the Rollins house. When he came waltzing down the street, Gob stopped and froze at the sight of the snake. We all howled with laughter, but Gob was not amused. I don't recall who won the rook game that day. That's the end of Chapter 1, The Early Life. Now I'm going to photograph the title page. All right. Thanks for watching Chapter 1 of Dear David and Mary. I hope you'll follow with me through some of the rest of his letter to his children. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and join me.